this computer. All right, and I'm going to start the webinar, and Leora is now spotlighted. And we are starting.
Should I give a couple of seconds to let the people come in?
Yes. Okay. Oh, I'm also going to share the welcome screen.
Oh, okay.
We are live.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. My name is Leora Tanwatko-Ross. I am the outgoing president of the Peninsula Democratic Coalition. Usually when there's not a pandemic, we're in Los Altos and we are eating sandwiches and mingling and seeing each other face to face. But unfortunately, we are on Zoom today. And usually the most difficult part of this whole entire afternoon is introducing the elected officials. But one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that I can just have you all identify yourself in the chat. I saw Pat Showalter from Mountain View City Council was here first. Thank you for being here. Josh Becker, Ray Mueller, Jessica Spicer, Mike Kasperzak. Thank you all for joining us today. We have one very formal order of business that we need to take care of. We need to elect the new board of the PDC. And before we do that, though, I want to acknowledge specifically Mr. Joe Rolfe. He's an inspiration to everyone who volunteers, everyone who wants to make the Democratic Party as strong as it can be. And him, along with Diane Rolfe, they are an absolute power couple. They are goals for anyone who is in any kind of partnership. Thank you, Joe, for all of your service to the PDC. You bring so much light and energy to our club, and I can't thank you both enough for everything you've done over the past several decades. I also want to thank Laura Martinez, Chris Rote, and Ron David, who are also leaving our board. Thanks for volunteering your time and for serving with us. I'm going to turn it over now to Emily Ramos, who's the chair of our nominations committee this year. She is going to kick off the voting process for electing our new board. She's also running tech, so I want to acknowledge that too.
Hi, sorry, it took me a while to switch spotlights. There we go. I'm going to share my screen again, this time with the new board. I would like to thank the nominating committee, who was myself, Shali Surke, Diane Rolfe, Zach Ross, and Kristen Johnson. And let me share this screen right now. Of the new board members and our new executive board. So for executive board, we're going to have a new president, Lori Holtzberg, who I'm sure is very excited to take this all on. Then we have Shali Surke as our now our new vice president and program director. Chelsea Bonini is staying on as our secretary, and Zach Ross and Max Ross, the Ross brothers, will be handling our treasury. We also have new board members coming aboard. We have Megan Fraley, Ron Friedenthal, Alex Kobayashi, Raven Malone, and Claire Nunez. So we're really excited to have new board members join us. And so in order to approve these board members, we're going to run a poll. Because we don't just appoint them, we have to have a vote of the membership to approve our board. So I'm going to launch this poll now, and this will be for approval of both the executive board and the new members. So I'm launching the poll now. Okay, so with that, it looks like a number of people have voted very quickly. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the polling and share the results. And it looks like we have a new board. Hooray! All right, we're gonna now go to our program, which will be introduced by our new president, Lori Holtzberg. And let me add her spotlight.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the new year for the PDC. It looks like it's going to be another challenging year, but we made it through 2020 under Leora's leadership. I'm truly honored to be elected president of the PDC, the largest and the best Democratic club on the peninsula. I look forward to serving all of you members well, and I want to thank you all for renewing your membership and all of you new members for joining us. You won't be sorry. As the term closes on Leora's presidency, I realize that she will definitely be a hard act to follow. However, I do promise that I won't get pregnant. I wish I could hear you laughing because I know Leora's cracking up. I can see her cracking up. Right
I'm
now.
unmuting myself to laugh.
Oh my God.
I know that's a scary thought, isn't it? She was and is an amazing leader. I've learned so much from her with her ability to juggle work, marriage, 2 pregnancies, parenthood, and the presidency of the PDC. I certainly don't have all of her challenges, thank goodness. But Leora was always cheerful, upbeat, and led us to fight the good fight for democratic principles. I also want to thank the board on their participation in all of our PDC activities in spite of our COVID challenges. And thank you, Emily, for being our new tech person. That role scares me, and I'm really glad that you're competent in it because I certainly am not. This year, we started with in-person board meetings, and then we switched to Zoom. But even with that, we accomplished a lot. We actually raised almost $30,000 with our virtual picnic, along with having several national Democratic Senate candidates at the picnic. It was a huge success. We also had a great Black Lives Matter program with over 200 attendees, and we have many people asking for the recording of the program. So I think that was a big success. As I take over from Leora, I look forward to working with our new board and our members and coming up with creative ways of serving our population and having programs. And I look forward to working with Shali as our new program chair, Chelsea resuming the position of secretary, and Zach and Max as treasurer. And of course, I can't forget Carol Kuiper, who has been our membership secretary for so many years and done an amazing job. So let's give a virtual thank you to Carol. Well, now, after 2 postponements, one being COVID, one I can't even remember, it is my great pleasure to introduce the speakers for today's presentation, which is the promise of U.S. carbon neutrality by 2050. Our speakers, Yifei Wang and Dave Kane, both are members of the Silicon Valley North Chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby. The mission of the Citizens Climate Lobby is to create the political will to pass national climate legislation aimed at getting our country carbon neutral by 2050 in order to stabilize the climate. Their method they call old school, which involves, sorry about that, I forgot to turn off my phone, includes local civic engagement and lobbying members of Congress by their constituents. The Citizens Climate Lobby also does educational outreach to organizations like ours, encouraging us to pitch in and help, which I'm sure that we are going to want to do. The next election cycle promises to make or break on climate. We're cheered by the incoming Biden administration, hopefully, and as Ife and Dave point out, the country is poised to enact big-time legislation that would turn the corner on climate change. They will also share some key policy questions that ultimately only regular people, not climate experts, need to weigh in, regular people like us. After a short introductory presentation, they're going to lead us through a policy discussion and then do some polling. They're very interested in how all of you feel about these issues, and we are too. I want to remind you to put all your questions in the Q&A, only comments in the chat, because your questions won't be answered if they're in the chat, only in the Q&A. And again, all of you elected officials, please sign into the chat so we know you're here. And I would like to now turn the meeting over to Dave and Yifei.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Lori, for the introduction. And thank you all for being here and having us here today. We are extremely excited to be here to talk about the promise of carbon neutrality by 2050. And it's not only because we believe that we must do this in order to keep our planet inhabitable in the next century, but it's also because this goal that we talk about, carbon neutrality by 2050, we believe it can really happen. And let me explain why. So if you have been following the news, you'll know that climate change news has never been this exciting before. And partially it's because things have never quite changed this quickly before. For example, on Biden's first day in office, he signed numerous climate-related executive orders, like rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement and revoking the permit for the Keystone Pipeline. Recently, GM, a company that just last year wanted more lenient fossil fuel efficiency standards, announced that it will go completely electric by 2035. And this is just in the last month, right? Imagine what the rest of the year or even the next 4 years could really hold. And that's why it's an extremely exciting time to be involved. There's so much change happening. And I think now it's up to you to decide whether you're going to be part of this green revolution that we're undergoing. Hopefully today we can convince you to join us on that journey. But let me start where we currently are, which is in Palo Alto. I'm talking to you here today from Palo Alto. But a little bit about me, I grew up in the Midwest, in the suburbs of Chicago, and I moved to the Bay Area in 2013 to do my master's at Stanford. And during those years, I fell in love with the Bay Area and with Palo Alto. This is a picture of one of my favorite spots in this area. It's the foothills. Veranda Lake. Maybe some of you have been there, but I used to love coming here to read and hike on Sunday afternoons. I left the Bay Area in 2015 to work abroad, and I returned 3 years later. And when I returned, I saw this. The Bay Area, every year in September now, we experience these fires. But before that, fires were not really a problem. I didn't know that they would be a problem. And it seemed like in just 3 years, climate change had exacerbated at a speed that I could never have fathomed, leaving noticeable and devastating effects on our local society. And now I would say that the fires are almost an expected part of our seasons. And that didn't feel right. It didn't feel like the home that I once loved and was looking forward to returning to. But I also knew that this problem was exacerbated by climate change, and I wanted to do something about it. So I began to try to take action. I made sure to recycle and compost as much as I could. I bought a bike and I rode every day. I signed local petitions to the Palo Alto City Council to do things like reduce plastics at restaurants. I started educating myself on local Palo Alto sustainability initiatives. And during this self-education, I learned that Palo Alto has reduced their carbon emissions by 50% from 1990 levels already, and they are aiming for 80% by 2030, which is an ambitious goal. And reading this, I felt proud to live in such a community that was spearheading this goal towards net zero emissions as soon as possible. But as I was reading this, I also read that California, the state, is only aiming for 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And I started thinking, okay, well, if that's California's goal, then surely other states will inevitably be 5 or 10 years behind at best. And then maybe it'll take another decade or two for other countries to come on board. And this is only a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The truth is that temperatures have already risen. On average, now over 1 degree Celsius from pre-industrial levels. Even if we stop all CO2 emissions now, temperatures will keep rising and we will reach these climate tipping points. It felt like that even if we made these changes at a local level, we couldn't do it fast enough. And that's when I started to look at everything around me. The cell phone that I use every day, the laptop that I'm using now to speak to you, the house that I live in, everything that we own was made through energy. And that energy most likely came from fossil fuel emitting sources. The problem just felt so embedded into our society that it felt impossible to extricate quickly enough. And I didn't know what else to do in that moment but feel the gravity of the situation. I realized that was the moment that I actually accepted climate change. I knew about it before, but I hadn't quite accepted it because accepting it meant subjecting myself to a problem that just felt too large to solve. But also the problem is too important to ignore, right? But alongside this depressing news about the climate, there was also some heartening news, and that is primarily people's changing views on climate change. This is a photo that I took September 2019 before the pandemic, and it's a photo of the climate protests in downtown Palo Alto. But they weren't just happening in Palo Alto. On this day, over 7.5 million people showed up over 150 different countries to demand action on climate change. Even Republicans are changing their mind. Now, the majority, I think 70% of Republicans under the age of 40 think that the government should be doing more to address climate change. And we have a president now who believes that climate change is a dire problem. And so why does this solution feel so far away? The executive orders that Biden has signed are great and they signal intent, but how do we translate that into tangible actions that we can see tomorrow? So to understand that, take a look at this photo. Let's say that each individual or organization is an instrument in this orchestra. They're all assembled, they're ready to go. They're bringing their passion for music to the table. But there's something missing here, right? There's something missing. And you might say that it's the conductor, but I would say there's something more fundamental to that is missing. That thing is the musical score. You know, they need a concrete and actionable plan that they can all follow, they can all get behind to work together. In the world of climate change, that means we need a national policy that everybody can rally behind to unilaterally move away from fossil fuels. But what could that plan be? What passed today could change the entire system in favor of the climate tomorrow? What about a policy that puts a price on carbon? I'm not saying this is the best policy out there, but I think it's something that we should at least consider. The ideas behind carbon pricing, it's simple. carbon emissions have a real dollar cost associated with them. The fair thing to do is to price them at its source, to price them the moment you extract it from the ground, so that you're paying the costs that it'll eventually incur down the road. And this incentivizes people at all levels of the economy to move away from fossil fuels and start investing in more clean energy alternatives. Fossil fuel prices will go up, clean energy prices will go down, and people will naturally choose to buy products made with clean energy simply because they're cheaper. Economists have backed this idea for decades. Over 40 other countries have implemented some sort of carbon pricing and have seen their emissions drop significantly. There was a recent article as well published in The Economist that singled out the UK as leading the carbon net zero race in the EU, with a 40% reduction in CO2 emissions since 1990. A lot of this was actually attributed to the heavy taxes on coal that incentivize people to invest in improving alternative ways of generating energy. And so this concept of putting a price on carbon, it has worked before, and it's something that we should consider now. So before I turn it over to Dave, I think we have some time for some quick Q&A. Doesn't look like there's anything, so maybe we should just move on, and we'll definitely have a lot of time for discussion afterwards. Dave?
Okay. Should be able to see my screen. So I want to thank Yafei. We bring a message of hope, and the message of hope is that carbon neutrality can be achieved by 2050. What is carbon neutrality? Well, it means that the amount of carbon pollution, that is greenhouse gases that gets emitted in the United States, is matched by the amount of carbon that is removed from the atmosphere and sequestered somehow. So most of the balance, as you can imagine, is about the emission part, and carbon pricing has a pivotal role in bringing down carbon pollution. Greenhouse gases, in other words, from burning coal, natural gas, driving around in our cars. The economic models, the models that Yafei mentioned, suggests that carbon pricing works. It works big and it works fast. Over 8 major carbon pricing bills auditioned in the last Congress. Any one of these bills would put us on a track to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and the country as a whole could begin to look at the climate crisis a little bit in the rearview mirror. But none of these bills will pass Congress or stay passed without a durable social contract to get everybody on board. This is a national effort. And that social contract can be forged in terms of what is done with all the revenue. How much revenue? One model suggests that as much as $600 billion is made available through carbon pricing. So the question is, what do we do with all the revenue? And that's how we have an opportunity to make some choices. Yafei and I are interested in your take, and I'm going to walk you through a series of possibilities. And as I do, I encourage you to log your questions and comments. Put your questions in Q&A. I see we also have some questions that I look forward to addressing in the questions. But your contribution to the dialogue is key. And then we're going to take a poll. You'll have an opportunity for choosing or voting for your preferred alternative, and we can see where their consensus lies. Are you ready? Okay. So this is a possibility. Paying down the public debt. Economists agree that the increasing public debt is unsustainable. And we've just added debt to major economic stimulus bills to float the economy during the pandemic in a major way. And we're going to be passing this accumulating in debt along to our children and grandchildren. By paying down public debt with carbon pricing, we have the ability to address two major intergenerational issues. Do you like this option or not? Please enter in your Q&A and we'll get to these questions. So here's another possibility. Why not take the money and invest it in green infrastructure? Investing in infrastructure supported by both sides of the aisle. It's a Biden administration priority, and I expect that we'll see a major infrastructure bill by the end of the year, introduced in Congress. The revenues from carbon pricing can be used to pay for that infrastructure. Imagine a resilient power grid optimized for renewable energy. Texans would love to have this right about now. Or high-speed rail crisscrossing the country, just like in Europe and other major developed countries. Or smart highways, smart cities, carbon sequestering as part of agriculture. Solar and wind built out in a massive scale. What possibilities we have if we just took the money and plowed it into greening our infrastructure. So here's another option. How about using the revenue for reducing personal or corporate income tax? It's called a tax swap. A tax swap appeals to conservatives because it's revenue neutral, doesn't grow government. It's what we keep hearing when we lobby members of Congress. And as such, it boosts the chance of getting major carbon pricing legislation through a closely divided Congress, attracting just enough Republicans to beat the filibuster. Many of you might be aware, some of you not, that a carbon tax swap has been working successfully in British Columbia for almost a decade. So what are your views on a tax swap? Please contribute the Q&A dialogue that we'll be having shortly. Okay. This is close to many of our hearts and things that Democrats and progressives talk about all the time. What about using the money for remedying environmental and climate injustices? This option appeals to our basic sense of fairness. First, clamp down and clean up the fossil fuel polluters. Then protect the most vulnerable from climate change effect. Sounds good? Okay, what about funding clean energy innovation? How many of you saw Bill Gates on 60 Minutes just last Sunday? He said, and I quote, "We can't beat climate change without investing in innovation." In our meetings with conservative members of Congress, we find that innovating our way out of the climate box is really popular. And this increases our chance of getting carbon pricing bills through Congress. Bottom line, innovation is what the United States is really good at. But if you're a contrarian, do you think there's something wrong with this picture? Again, I urge you to log in your question or comments in Q&A and we'll discuss. Now here's a novel and seemingly counterintuitive approach. It returns all the money as monthly dividend checks in equal amounts to every citizen. Revenue neutrality appeals to conservatives, but it also buffers the economically disadvantaged from rising energy costs from carbon pricing. Moreover, the rich don't come out ahead because of their huge carbon footprints. Any of you have heard about the dividend option? What do you think? Please join our Q&A and we'll have that conversation. And lastly, there are other possibilities beyond what I'm considering here. Possibilities for achieving that social contract, social compact that brings us all together. It's the wild card. Here's an opportunity for your creative input to put in the Q&A or chat, and we'll address those options. I've got one or two. We can blue sky what we do with our carbon revenues. So now I have a collage, and now we're at the opportunity where we can begin to consider which of these options really leads to that social compact that we all buy in. With a social compact and carbon pricing, we have a true climate solution will take us to our destination. So I'm going to open this up, and I'm hopeful that this will launch a Q&A discussion where you all participate, and at the end of which I'm going to take a poll. We're going to find out where the consensus lies. All right. Yafei, I see we have some questions.
Thank you, Dave. I think the first question from Lisa Oliver is a great one to talk about, which sort of underscores the whole conversation today of her question is carbon neutrality by 2050 too late? Should we even be talking about this? I think, could you answer that?
Yeah. Well, we've been delaying for decades, and certainly we could afford to do things differently at a more leisurely pace than where we are today. It is not too late, but it's almost too late. So what I'm convinced, and many of the people that are part of our Citizens Climate Lobby convinced, is that we need a comprehensive approach. Some people call it an engineered approach to get there. It's no longer possible to ad hoc our way to carbon neutrality in time. The carbon pricing is one way to do it. We strongly believe that because the economists all say that we can still get there pretty much if we have a gradually increasing price. But there's other ways too, and I don't want to assume this is the only way. Yes, we can do it.
I think following along that, there's been some questions about policy as well. So there's one in the chat that is asking how likely is it that Congress will pass a carbon pricing bill and when?
Yeah, that's a great question. We talk with Congress and we watch what you hear the Congress people say, members of Congress say publicly, and what they're saying privately is very different. When I started getting involved in citizen lobbying, we would come into members of Congress up on Capitol Hill, progressives, conservatives, and they just couldn't wait to get us out of the office. But about 2 or 3 years ago, I could tell by the questions that they asked. I could tell that they're interested. Well, okay, if we did this and that, what would be the tax credit or possibilities on this? We would get really serious questions. Today, I can tell you, because we talk with members of Congress all the time on both sides of the aisle, including the most conservative ones. And we're getting really intelligent questions, and you can see they're primed. They're primed to do something. Now, we still have the filibuster. It's not so much a problem getting legislation through the House. We still have a filibuster. And so some of these options that I'm talking about as a social compact, we think would have a good chance of drawing that 10 or so senators that we could use to effectively pass the legislation. The other consideration is called reconciliation. You've heard a lot about this in the stimulus. It's a much more complicated process. It turns out that carbon pricing fits right into a reconciliation process. And it could be alloyed with a major infrastructure bill this year. So we are hopeful that there's ways to get through Congress some major legislation. And the last thing I want to say, this is a great question, is the winds at our backs, literally. All of the severe weather is no longer the case where it was even just 5 years ago when people say, geez, I wonder about this climate change thing. Everybody gets it. We need to act, and I think we will, with your help.
That's a great answer, Dave. Yeah, I think a lot of what I personally have gone through is just this feeling of hopelessness, like, oh my God, everything has to change. And like, how do you change a system overnight? And I think one of the really cool things about a price on carbon is that it does kind of touch everything in a way, which that was sort of why it appealed to me. Moving on, maybe we talk about policy at the national level. There was a question from Lori, which brings it a little local, and she's asking, where do the U.S. and California fit into the world standing of carbon use?
Yeah, so as you probably know, I think many of you are well informed, California is not only a national leader and a world leader in addressing climate change. Started with Arnold Schwarzenegger, accelerated under Jerry Brown, and now with Gavin Newsom. I think we really set the standard for the rest of the country. And the major backbone policy is called cap and trade. Cap and trade is a market-based approach. It puts an implicit price on carbon because it limits the number of allowances for pollution. And so that is the backbone. Of course, we put a lot of other legislation on top of that, but at the very foundation, that's the process that we use. And there's a market for a fixed number of allowances that are put into play every year with a floor price. Unfortunately, in California, the floor price of carbon is too low. There's a number of reasons for that. Back in 2009, a very similar attempt to pass cap and trade legislation was made in the Congress under the Obama administration. It failed for a lot of complicated reasons called the Waxman-Markey legislation. One of the reasons that failed is that corporate America hates it. Why do they hate it? Well, I've had the opportunity to talk with a number of them in some of my prior business, and they have to put a whole new business process in place, whole new business process to track the cap and trade allowances and the marketing and so forth. They come back and they say, why not just put a carbon tax? Why not just put a carbon tax? We have all kinds of people in our company that know how to do this. We'll manage it, we'll abide by it. Some of the major petroleum companies in the United States, believe it or not, favor carbon tax. So this is a little bit of what we've done in California. I think it's set the stage. Question for California, how would we merge what we're doing in California with a federal policy of carbon pricing? That's another good question. All right.
I think also part of Lori's question was, how does California and the US fit into the world standing of carbon use? So like compared to other countries, I guess. Mm-hmm.
I mean, what we're doing compared to other countries?
Yeah, how badly are we emitting carbon?
Oh, how are we doing?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. So the good news is the United States is no longer the greatest polluter of greenhouse gases. China by a long shot. In the past decade, they've built so many coal plants that they zoomed right by us. However, per capita, we're the largest carbon emitter in the world. And it's very likely no one will ever beat us. Each one of us, directly or indirectly, are responsible for somewhere between 18 and 20 tons every year of carbon emitted to the atmosphere. If you go to an underdeveloped country, it's just a matter of a few tons. If you go to Europe, for example, a developed country, it's 8 to 10 tons. So we have a lot of work to do to bake the use of fossil fuels out of our economy. We've held the line for the last 4 or 5 years, but we're nowhere, largely because of fracking, by the way. and we're substituting now cheap natural gas for coal, but we have to do a lot better.
Thank you, Dave. We have some people who are, I guess maybe going back to the original question that we wanted to know from everybody here, which is, if we were to collect a tax, we have all this money to spend, how would we spend it? People are responding in the Q&A with their thoughts. And I was hoping that maybe we can elevate some of these people to panelists to talk more about why they believe a certain action should be taken with this money. So the first responses are from S.E. Stone and Gary Kremen. They talk about this idea of a safety net or using the money to help the disadvantaged. Maybe S.E., if you want to unmute and maybe elaborate on that.
Yeah, I just think, it is a good opportunity if we have this sort of extra funding source to be proactive with the things that we as Democrats want, and to really replace some of the cuts that have been happening, to make sure that Medi-Cal and Medicare are fully funded, to make sure that people's pensions are funded and Social Security is funded, and that we have money for schools and money for communities. I think rather than trying to appeal to Republicans with these sort of, like market solutions, which I'm not sure would even work, I think, taking this opportunity and being proactive with what we want.
Yeah, I think that's a real important point. And so by applying this new revenue, we can do many things without increasing the debt, obviously. The first consideration is, would we ever be able to get it through Congress? In other words, could we drive major carbon legislation through with only 50 votes in the Senate, or just a bare majority? If we don't do it in the next election cycle because we made the wrong choice, then we've missed a historic opportunity to turn the corner on climate change, because we cannot wait another 4 or 5 years. So some concessions of some kind might be something that we'd consider. But I do think that your suggestion falls within the option that I laid out, sort of restricted to climate and environmental injustice, but I think it does apply on how we could use that push that as an option. So it's definitely something we should consider.
I think it's also extremely important now, like we've seen a lot of disparities exacerbated with COVID. So it's also a really good opportunity to invest in closing that gap. I think was Gary, do you have anything to add? Because you also talked about.
No, actually, I think what Essie asked was the most important question, especially one worry is that a climate tax, unless implemented right, kind of a carbon tax, could be a regressive tax and disproportionately hurt those that are not affluent, hurt those that are poorer. So I'm kind of concerned if it's a regressive, or is it what's your sense on the fairness here?
Yeah. So fairness is certainly a major consideration. And as some of you know, France attempted to put a price on petrol and other activities that increased the cost. And you may have recalled last year, the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Jacket movement, and it was simply a revolt, popular revolt against it, and they had to pull the whole tax back. So I think that a fairness and equitable approach is the only answer, and that's part of achieving what I call a social compact, that it's good for everybody. And there's two of the options that do address this. And by the way, if we just plow the money into green infrastructure, or we plow the revenue into innovation, we don't get that sense of fairness. But the first of which is you start from the bottom up, and we worry about the people who are economically disadvantaged. First, about dealing with the impact of climate change and pollution in local communities. And secondly, about raising them up to deal with the economic inequities that the country is fallen into sort of an abyss. So that's one option. The other one is actually having the dividend. The studies show that about the lower 40% are completely buffered from a carbon tax. And this varies a little bit across different congressional districts in the country, but it's certainly true here in Silicon Valley. But 60% are either the same or come out ahead. There's a top 40% that pays the price. Why? As I said earlier, it's because their carbon footprint is much larger. So that's a consideration. Besides the fact that a carbon dividend is essentially, we're all invested because they get that monthly check. And that prevents political manipulation. It's like Social Security. You get the check from your dividend. We're all bought in on doing something about climate. So there's a couple of ways that we can address it. I'm sure there's others, but I do want to say that protecting the economically disadvantaged is key, because otherwise the whole social compact will unravel.
Yeah, that's a great point. Making sure we had to pass policies that make the majority of people happy, and also like the stickiness of something like a dividend, giving money back is like hopefully something that is pretty, that's not easily overturned. I think Blair Stewart also touched upon this, saying the solution should take us off fossil fuels and not increase income and wealth disparity between the top 10% and everybody else. So that also follows along what we have been talking about. Another topic, I think, that following along the what do we do with the money, Lisa Oliver suggested that we have 30 years to remake the energy infrastructure. The carbon dividend should be invested in new technology and carbon sequestration, and we haven't gotten to the hard stuff. Lisa, do you want to maybe elaborate on energy infrastructure?
Yeah, I think there's an important part about innovation, and a lot of studies and a lot of economic models have tried to figure out to what extent innovation can make a difference. And as I said earlier, is one of the options, is one of the things that Bill Gates has been talking about, many others. A lot of conservatives like innovation because it doesn't look like we have to do anything. We just innovate our way out somehow magically, and we might get their vote. The problem with innovation is the time to deploy. In other words, we're not talking about computer chips and mobile phones, smartphones. We're talking big, heavy investments. And even with solar and wind, this is heavy investments. And the time it takes from a major innovation to get to the market can take decades for deployment. One of the things about our procrastination with regards to innovation is we have to get to carbon neutrality with the technology we basically have. Fortunately, we have the technology for the most part. And certainly innovation can make a difference here and there, but it's just going to take too long in the power industry and in our infrastructure, roads, highways, railroads, to have that impact. So I personally question it. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, I think it was just, what do you think about energy? Using the funds for green infrastructure. Along those lines, Jonathan Weinberg asked about jobs. So jobs, he says, can the carbon tax be used to retain people who work in the fossil fuel industry? If not, what can we do to help that workforce? Where will the new jobs be? And can the carbon tax be used to help the traditionally disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, fortunately, the fossil industry is asset heavy and highly automated. There's not a lot of workers, even though there's a lot of concern about it. Even we go to coal miner and then so forth. There's a couple 100,000 jobs. We could pass legislation in some sense to just buy them out. It's not that expensive, but obviously we want to train them, give a life, but the amount of fossil fuel jobs is really on the margin. And I would certainly support, I think you would support, and Citizens Climate Lobby supports, finding a way of transitioning people out of the fossil industry as we begin to wind down our dependency into other kinds of jobs. The amount of jobs in clean energy is an order of magnitude larger. In many cases, good paying jobs. So we really have the opportunity. And by going to clean energy and all of these options that I'm talking about, the ability to have a robust economy as we transit to clean energy that's basically motivated by the price on carbon, incents Wall Street. The private part of our economy is 6 times larger than anything the government can do. Putting a price on carbon is the most powerful signal on Wall Street for them to make the transition, make the investment. If you think about what private investment can do, think about Elon Musk and what he's done for electric vehicles. Amazing.
Yeah, it does start with investment money. I think some things, especially putting it out at scale. To me, that's just, yeah. I missed a comment by Ron David earlier, which is alluding back to this idea of giving the money back to the people. And so he says, investing some of the carbon tax in energy innovation, subsidizing the green energy, and so on seems obvious to me. I think the rest of the money should be returned revenue neutrally. Money that the government collects for one purpose, to save the planet, shouldn't become cash cow for other purposes. Okay. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's an arguable point. I think that if you are And there are major projects that can only be done with government funding. And I was talking about the national grid, making a resilient green national grid is something only government can do. And so finding a way to make that kind of investment is critical. And there's many other ones as well. But most of our economy isn't efficiently addressed by government investment. It's addressed by private investment if it's incentive. And that is what the economists say is the best way to rid ourselves of fossil fuel and retain the measure of prosperity we now have.
We have elevated, so Adam Lorraine asked a few questions. And I was wondering whether he wanted to unmute and ask those questions live.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for being here. I think one of my questions about California cap and trade was touched on a bit by David, so thank you for that. But I was just curious about whether CCL is talking to Sunrise Movement and talking about the Green New Deal, which has gotten a lot more popular lately. Are these two initiatives competitive or are they complementary? And can Sunrise and other progressive groups pushing for a Green New Deal or Green New Deal style policy be an ally with CCL as you know, those of us interested in pushing the US toward carbon neutrality can work toward that ASAP? Thank you very much.
Yeah, we are talking with the Sunrise Movement, and in fact, some of the most energetic voices in Citizens Climate Lobby are young folks, which is largely aligned with the Sunrise Movement. To the question of the Green New Deal, there are many parts of the Green New Deal we all aspire for. And the Citizens Climate Lobby looks at many of these movements as running in the same direction along parallel tracks or parallel lanes. It's like we're traveling down a big freeway together. And we do honor and we respect, we look for ideas, we steal ideas, but we are strongly supportive of these complementary movements. There's no perfect solution, but we feel that there's an amalgam of possibilities, and that when carbon pricing gets into Congress and we go through the committee process, we'll begin to see that amalgamation take place. We're beginning to see some of the ideas and the tremendous aspirations of the Green New Deal realized. The only thing that we're going to say is that economically, you can't quite do it without a carbon tax. The extent to which a carbon tax is mainstream or partly there, that's to be determined. So we look forward to that engagement.
Yeah, that's okay. I think that's all the questions that I see related to what do we do with a carbon tax, the money. And a lot of these other questions are more about political will or how do we pass something like this? So maybe let's pivot over to those questions, unless you had some other things you wanted to say.
Well, I just want to get to be question of time. I promised everybody that they would get a chance to vote. So I would be mindful of the time on that, but we wanted to see where your consensus was on a carbon pricing. We can talk, we can continue the conversation. I'd love to continue the conversation.
Are we not going until 3:30? Sorry, I'm so sorry. I thought we were going till 3:30. I don't know why. Yeah, let's probably wrap it up.
Okay, so I'm going to share a screen with you.
We are going till 3:30.
Okay, all right. I'm
We are
sorry.
going till 3:30. I would suggest that we vote and then go on with other questions and issues while we have these options on our mind.
Okay.
Okay, that sounds great.
So we have a number of options that I talked about earlier. And there's a number of things that are relevant to this a decision. One is a solution that's equitable. We talked about that. One that's tangible, that relates to individual people. One that's politically sustainable. And lastly, is there an X factor? Is there something that just is so appealing to you? So what I'm going to do, we've started to launch the voting. And so I encourage all of you to make your choices.
We have about a 25% response rate right now. So I think we'll wait a little longer for more people to respond.
Almost 2/3 voted now. Good.
There's a few more who haven't voted. But the responses are slowing down, so I think you can feel free to end it whenever.
Let's go and show. Okay, ready? So here's your consensus. And what we see is there's a strong preference for green infrastructure investment, which is along the aspirations of the Green New Deal. There's also a strong support. In second place is redressing climate and environmental injustices. And in third place is carbon dividends. Great. Okay. It's been really good to have you weigh in on this. As I said, we're very interested in how you were going to vote. So my next question is, now that we've discussed, I'd like to run a second poll, which is, given that you have a consensus, should the Peninsula Democratic Coalition have a social compact, or as a poll on the social compact? In other words, what should we do with the revenue?
Oh, whoops, that's a different poll than I had prepared. The current poll right now is, should PDC adopt a position on a national climate policy for achieving carbon neutrality by 2050.
Okay, I see we have a strong preference to taking taking a policy position, which is what I was hoped that you would do. You're in good company. This election cycle really represents once in a generation opportunity to make a mark. And if you recall the climate concerto metaphor that Yafei mentioned, that an enlightened national policy with social compact can be passed into legislation by Congress, really is the key to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. And so here's some other party organizations that have already done so. And Yafei and I really look forward to the possibility that you'll join this list. So in forging a policy consensus on carbon pricing, you've taken a step forward on the journey to carbon neutrality by 2050. Thank you. It's really been enriching, great conversation so far, which I'm hoping that will continue. Should we open up for further questions and discussion?
Yeah, I think we should do that.
All right.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question from Alexander Melendrez. And he says, we are seeing an increase in community choice aggregates for clean energy. In fact, there is a new joint power CCA forming called California Community Power. However, investor-owned utilities like PG&E continue to be a weight on these kinds of organizations with things like utility exit fees. Is there political will to empower these local clean power organizations in California or nationwide?
Yeah, I think that it's a little bit out of my bailiwick. We have supported community choice at CCL at the local level. All of us are customers, and the whole community choice movement really started in Marin County probably 5 or 10 years ago, and it's catching on nationwide. So I really think that there's a bottom-up, a top-down approach for achieving carbon neutrality. Bottom-up approach is really community. There's a social compact that I talked about but this at a local level that works very well. And so what one would like to see is national legislation that parallels the kind of legislation that we have in California that supports and enables community choice nationwide. Having said that, this is just one aspect, a very large aspect having to do with where we get our electric power. There's many, many, many other parts of our economy, such as transportation, for example, that are not addressed, but this is a really important component.
Thank you, Dave. I'm not too familiar with this proposal, but maybe Dave, you are more familiar with it. So, but also I think just gonna throw this out there and feel free to answer it or not. This is from Arthur Keller, and he asked, there is a proposal by former Assembly member Ira Ruskin for a fee bait on cars. That's a tax on pollution and a rebate on clean cars. What are the prospects for that idea?
So you're saying it's a fee bait on cars, a rebate on cars, or it's a reverse?
It's a tax on pollution and a rebate on cars. I think we can, yeah, it doesn't sound like either of us are really fit to answer this question, I think. So we can possibly move on.
We do have a gas guzzler tax of cars. And we have had various rebates. When I bought an electric car 4 or 5 years ago, there was a good rebate that was available from the federal government and also the state. So rebates are important, incentives are important. What's good about that is it's all positive, it's not a penalty. But at the end of the day, the economists tell to get all the people who aren't interested in electric cars to get on a bicycle or buy an electric car, the best thing going is a carbon tax. In fact, economically, you can prove it mathematically, it's the most efficient way to go, is a carbon price. I see there's a comment here in the Q&A that McKibben says that even a huge carbon tax is much too late. I beg to disagree. I think the economic studies that have been done at Stanford in the energy modeling forum, and I think at Columbia University and a number of other places elsewhere, Noah Kaufman shows that we can do it. We can do it. On the other hand, it's really hard to get a combination of different incentives and rules and regulations to do it. It can be done, it's just really hard to do.
There's a question sort of about balancing this transition to renewables and from the system that we have set up currently for many Americans. I'll just read the question. So just to look at one segment of the economy, a generation ago, 25% of jobs in California were tied to the automobile industry to some degree: manufacturing, road servicing, licensing, policing, importing, exporting. Economically, in terms of jobs, with a huge stake, economically, in terms of jobs, with a huge stake we have in not changing from fossil fuels, what is the evidence and argument that is most persuasive that transitioning to renewables, reducing carbon emissions, and slowing climate change will still allow workers to enjoy good paying jobs and access to the American dream?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I wouldn't say that I can answer it very well. We have more challenge to do with automation than we do, I believe, in transitioning to a clean economy. And as I said earlier, most of the jobs at risk that are energy related are in the fossil fuel industry, and there's not a lot of jobs that we're talking about. So I think it needs to be looked at carefully. The economic models which I have suggested, these are integrated economic models that look at both the effect on the climate and they look at the effect on the economy, suggest that it's pretty much a wash. If you gradually increase the price so you don't shock the economy, we can manage the transition, not only to clean energy jobs, but new jobs that haven't even been invented yet. And the GDP isn't impacted very much either. So a carbon price that sends a signal to everybody that gradually increases is not something where jobs is likely to be an issue. We do know that it's not going to be a major job generator, but we also know that it's not going to be a net loss of jobs. I would just say in the sideline, we used to think of climate models as being all of what it's about in climate change, these physical models that talk about global warming. We've passed a tipping point. Now we're economic modeling for all its warts and all its faults. These integrated economic models are really the best way of being able to compare various policies. So what I invite you to look at the economic modeling that's going on. A tremendous amount of work has been done about policies that work and policies that don't.
I think also that my personal view on this topic is that we have to make this transition or else we don't have a planet to live on. And it's sort of, while you can make these higher level economic transitions, I think it's also up to like there will be pain points along this transition, and it's up to us and maybe our government to supply like the education means, for example, to help people transition smoothly. So there's I think this local level that plays into it too. But definitely it is a concern. And it's just the whole system somehow needs to work together. Yeah, and so it's a really great point that was brought up. I'm going to turn it over to more some political questions. So Barbara Kaiser asked, you mentioned the filibuster as being a problem passing climate neutrality and infrastructure bills in the Senate. How do you suggest we work to end the filibuster, which is a bipartisan issue? So bills like the one about climate change can finally be passed in the Senate.
Well, I think it's a dilemma we all face, not only on climate legislation, but all legislation. As all of us would agree, the Senate and Congress in general, but the Senate in particular, has been broken. It hasn't been working. It's there to pass legislation, debate legislation, to find out what people's position is on important bills that we face, such on climate change. So I guess the question I have is, if we can't end this filibuster, what do we do? And my fear is that we don't do nothing. It really will be too late. We've got to find a way to pass it, and we've got to find a way to make the bill attractive enough so that it isn't filibustered. This is a climate emergency. We cannot fail. So as much as I think the filibuster ending is something that will inevitably happen, I'm doubtful it will happen soon enough.
We have time for very quick last question. I think this is a great question to end on. So how can we get it's Blair Stort's question. The question is, how can we get the public behind actions to combat climate change? We see the disconnect between some politicians, example, the GOP in Texas, and the actual needs of the people.
Well, I would love you to join the Citizens Climate Lobby. You can be a Democrat, and you can also be a part of the Citizen Climate Lobby. You'll get firsthand view of what it's like to lobby members of Congress on climate. I think that, as I said, the wind is at our backs. I think the public is demanding it. As Yafei pointed out, most Republicans favor action on climate. And in fact, if you look at Republicans who are under the age of 40 and compare them to their Democratic counterparts, they're almost the same in terms of needing to take action. Your effort to take a position on taking action on climate change, the Peninsula Democratic Coalition, can have a major effect. And we're trying to build this momentum. We think the momentum is in our favor. I think that if you look for a solution that is in the extreme middle, I think there's a chance we can get it through. I really do. Not that you're going to get a lot of Republicans, but I think that based on when we talk with them, I think they're looking for a way to get out of denial and do something. Yes.
Well, Dave and Yifei, I thank you so much. You've really brought up some very complex issues, and I think we're all in agreement. We definitely have to do something about climate. I particularly am very impressed with the carbon tax. I like, the idea of that. That's my personal opinion, but our board will vote on whether we join you or not. Keeping my fingers crossed. And thank you, Emily, for all your great tech work and for conducting the election of officers. And I look forward to working with all of you this year. And please let me know if you have any suggestions, comments. We all need to work together, and hopefully we will be back to eating sandwiches in person once again. Thank you all very much for attending today. And don't forget to renew your membership if you haven't already.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Dave and Yifei.
All right, I'm going to remove all the spotlights. We are still technically live, but I'm going to stop the recording now.